Hey everyone, before this story pulls you in, take 1 second to support the channel by liking this video, subscribing for more powerful stories, and turning on notifications so you never miss a rise from the ashes moment. Welcome to Black Queen Dominion, where broken beginnings turn into unstoppable endings. This story begins in the quiet, overlooked corners of a life that was never celebrated. It begins with someone who chose a teaching job not because it paid well or impressed anyone, but because it felt honest. Teaching was never about status or applause. It was about shaping minds, building futures, and finding purpose in small daily victories that never made headlines. But to one family, purpose meant nothing if it did not come wrapped in prestige. From an early age, expectations were placed like heavy crowns that never quite fit. Success in that household was defined by titles that sounded powerful at dinner parties and salaries that demanded respect. Doctors, executives, politicians, and entrepreneurs were the only acceptable outcomes. Anything else was seen as wasted potential. So when the decision was made to become a teacher, the disappointment was immediate and brutal. It was not loud at first. It was subtle, quiet, and cutting. Support faded. Pride disappeared. Invitations slowed. Calls went unanswered. At first there was hope that time would soften their judgment. That once they saw the impact of the work, the dedication, the long nights of planning lessons and the early mornings spent guiding students, something would change. But instead of understanding, there was distance. Instead of encouragement, there was silence. And then came the final cut. Financial support was withdrawn without warning. Family gatherings became exclusive events. The teaching job was spoken of as if it were a personal failure, an embarrassment that needed to be hidden. The message was clear without ever being spoken aloud. Choose status or lose family. And when that choice was not reversed, the family chose to walk away. Being cut off was not just emotional. It was practical and painful. Rent became a monthly battle. Bills stacked up like accusations. There were nights when exhaustion felt heavier than hunger, and mornings when hope had to be forced into existence. Still, the classroom remained a sanctuary. In front of students there was strength. There was structure. There was meaning. The world might have dismissed a teacher as small, but inside those walls, lives were changing. Teaching demanded patience, resilience, and creativity. It demanded leadership without authority and influence without recognition. Over time, those skills began to shape something deeper. Confidence grew, not the loud kind, but the unshakable kind that forms when someone survives without applause. The absence of family approval slowly stopped defining self-worth. Instead, fulfillment came from students who believed in themselves for the first time, from communities that leaned on that quiet guidance. Yet beneath the surface there was still pain. Being cut off left scars. There were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of rejection returned unexpectedly. But those moments also forged something else. They built clarity. They built focus. They built a hunger not for revenge but for elevation. Opportunities began appearing in unexpected ways. Small leadership roles at school turned into district-level responsibilities. Committees formed. Projects expanded. Educational initiatives were launched, and suddenly, the same skills that had been dismissed by family were being recognized by institutions. Grants were awarded. Programs were funded. Names started circulating in rooms that mattered. Power does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as responsibility. Sometimes it grows slowly, unnoticed by those who once doubted. And while the family remained distant, the world beyond them was paying attention. By the end of that first year of being cut off, survival had turned into stability. Stability turned into influence. Influence hinted at something more. The teacher who was once written off was now becoming a force within the system. Not by abandoning values but by mastering them. Being cut off did not end the story. It stripped away distractions and revealed strength that had been underestimated by everyone, including the people who should have believed first. And just as resilience settled into confidence, a new door began to open, quietly, steadily, and with consequences no one was prepared for. With the family no longer present as a source of validation or pressure, there was space to think clearly, space to plan, space to grow without fear of judgment. Teaching was no longer just a job. It had become a platform. Recognition came from unexpected places. Educational boards noticed results that stood out against struggling systems. Students under this guidance performed better, not just academically but emotionally. Dropout rates declined. Confidence increased. Programs that were once considered impossible were now models for others to follow. Success was being measured not in money but in transformation. Soon leadership roles expanded beyond the classroom. Advisory positions opened up. Policy discussions included this voice. Training other educators became part of the mission. What began as a humble teaching career was evolving into educational authority. Power, real power rooted in impact, was taking shape. With power came resources. With resources came financial stability that had once been denied. Loans were paid off. Living conditions improved. Networks expanded. Invitations arrived not to family gatherings but to conferences, panels, and strategy meetings. The same family that had cut ties was now irrelevant to the future unfolding. Yet the past was not forgotten. It lived quietly in memory, not as bitterness but as fuel. Every late night of work, every risk taken, carried the echo of being told it was not enough. And instead of breaking, that echo sharpened ambition. A pivotal moment arrived in the form of a statewide educational reform initiative. A leadership role was offered, one that carried influence over funding, hiring, and curriculum decisions. Accepting it meant stepping fully into power. Not the kind that dominates, but the kind that reshapes systems from within. The decision was made without hesitation. This role changed everything. Authority expanded. Decisions affected thousands of students and educators. Policies were rewritten. Opportunities were created. The teacher who had once struggled to pay rent was now shaping futures on a massive scale. And still, humility remained. The roots of struggle ensured that power was handled with care. News of this rise traveled faster than expected. It reached places long abandoned. It reached ears that once dismissed. The family that had cut ties began to notice the absence they had created. Whispers replaced silence. Curiosity replaced indifference. Pride, once withheld, began to surface in indirect ways. But there was no rush to reconnect. Healing does not happen on demand. Respect cannot be reclaimed without accountability. The power now held was not designed to impress family. It was built to serve a purpose far greater. As influence grew, so did peace. The need for approval faded completely. Validation now came from results, from systems improved, from lives changed. The rejection that once defined identity had lost its grip. The balance of power had shifted completely. The one who was cut off was now standing at the center of influence, unshaken and self-made. And while the family had not yet returned, destiny was already preparing the moment when paths would cross again. Not as a plea for acceptance, but as proof that worth was never tied to their approval. But in the social spaces where worth is measured, judged, and quietly compared, the influence that had grown steadily was no longer hidden behind titles or committees. It had a presence now. A presence that shifted rooms, redirected conversations, and made people listen. With the new leadership role came public recognition. Articles were written about educational reform and innovative leadership. Panels invited this once dismissed teacher to speak about resilience, community impact, and ethical power. Awards followed, not flashy ones meant for ego, but serious acknowledgments from governing bodies that shaped policy and funding. The work was no longer local. It was regional, even national in its reach. Power changed daily life in subtle ways. Security replaced anxiety. Choice replaced desperation. Decisions were made from vision, not survival. And yet, despite everything gained, there was no urge to announce success to the past. Silence remained intentional. Silence had become strength. But silence has a way of drawing attention. The family, once confident in their judgment, now faced the discomfort of reality catching up to them. Extended relatives began sharing links, stories, and updates. The name they had quietly removed from conversations was now circulating in respectable spaces. Pride crept in before remorse did. The narrative shifted internally from rejection to justification. They had not been wrong, they told themselves. They had simply been misunderstood. An invitation arrived one evening, carefully worded and emotionally neutral. It was not an apology. It was not a confession. It was an opening, framed as reconciliation but rooted in curiosity. The family wanted to reconnect. Not urgently, not humbly, just enough to re-enter the orbit of success they now recognized. The invitation was read without reaction. No anger rose. No excitement followed. There was only clarity. Power had changed perspective. Where once there might have been a need to explain or defend, now there was only choice. And the choice was to wait. Meanwhile, the work intensified. A groundbreaking education initiative was launched, focused on underserved communities that had long been ignored by those chasing prestige. Funding was secured. Teams were assembled. Systems were redesigned. This was leadership shaped by lived experience, not theory. Every decision reflected an understanding of what it meant to be overlooked. The initiative gained momentum quickly. Results spoke louder than promotion ever could. Graduation rates surged. Teacher retention improved. Communities once written off began thriving. The story of this success became inseparable from the person leading it. Influence solidified into authority. With authority came visibility. Public events, ceremonies, and conferences filled the calendar. And then came the moment no one could avoid. A large national education summit was announced, one that would be covered extensively by media and attended by political figures, corporate sponsors, and thought leaders. The keynote speaker role was offered without hesitation. Accepting it meant stepping onto a stage that defined legacy, not just career. The summit was hosted in a city close to where the family lived. News traveled fast. Attendance lists circulated. Programs were printed. The family saw the name in bold letters, positioned at the center of the event. The realization settled in slowly and then all at once. The one they had cut off was now someone they would have paid to meet. Days before the summit, another message arrived. This one carried more emotion, more urgency. Still no apology, but a clear desire to be present. To attend. To reconnect publicly. It was framed as support, as pride finally acknowledged. Again, there was no immediate response. Power is not proven by how loudly one responds, but by how intentionally one moves. The decision was made not from bitterness, but from boundaries. Reconnection would not happen on a stage designed for validation. It would not happen in front of cameras. If it happened at all, it would be on terms shaped by respect, not convenience. The summit arrived. The stage was vast. The audience was influential. The speech delivered was not about revenge or personal triumph. It was about redefining success, about the danger of equating worth with titles, about the silent strength of professions that shape society without recognition. It was about teachers, about underestimated paths, about power finding those who stay aligned with purpose. The applause was long and genuine. Standing ovations echoed through the hall. Media coverage followed immediately. Quotes circulated. Impact multiplied overnight. And somewhere in that audience the family watched. They saw not just success but certainty. Not just authority but peace. The absence of need was unmistakable. This was not someone seeking approval. This was someone who had outgrown it. After the summit, the world shifted again. Offers expanded beyond education. Advisory roles at national levels. Consulting positions. Strategic partnerships. The influence now crossed industries. Power had fully arrived. One truth becomes unavoidable. The family no longer held emotional leverage. The power dynamic had reversed completely. And the question was no longer whether reconnection would happen, but whether it was even necessary. Because when power finds you, it does not ask who doubted you. It asks what you will do with everything you've become. And the answer to that question would define the next chapter. But something that must be carried with intention. Influence had reached its peak form, the kind that reshapes systems quietly while the world watches the surface. Every move now mattered not because of ego but because thousands of lives were tied to the outcomes. The days following the summit were filled with momentum that did not slow. National leaders sought counsel. Educational institutions adjusted strategies based on the reforms already proven successful. Funding streams aligned automatically with vision. What once required endless justification now required only a signature. This was not dominance. This was earned authority. Yet with authority comes confrontation, not always from enemies, but from unfinished emotional business. The family, having witnessed the summit and its aftermath, could no longer pretend distance was neutral. Silence now felt like loss. For the first time, the outreach carried something different. It carried humility, even if imperfectly expressed. There was an acknowledgement of absence. Not a full apology but a recognition of damage. The message did not demand forgiveness. It asked for space. Space to be present again. space to understand what had been lost. Power grants the ability to choose closure without surrender. After careful reflection, a decision was made to meet privately. Not to reconcile instantly, not to rewrite history, but to reclaim narrative control. The meeting would not be emotional. It would be grounded, balanced, equal. The reunion took place in a neutral setting, far from childhood memories and social expectations. There was no confrontation, no dramatic release. There was observation. The family sat across from someone they had underestimated, now composed, secure, and unmovable. The imbalance they once created no longer existed. They spoke of concern, of fear, of expectations shaped by their own insecurities. They spoke of wanting the best, of believing success only wore certain uniforms. The explanation was not accepted as justification, but it was heard. Listening did not mean agreeing. It meant understanding without absorbing blame. What surprised them most was the absence of resentment. There was no anger to negotiate with. No need for validation. Power had replaced pain with clarity. The teaching job they had mocked was now the foundation of everything they admired. And that truth was impossible to ignore. Boundaries were established calmly. Respect was non-negotiable. Dismissal would never be tolerated again. Connection, if it continued, would be built on recognition of worth, not status. The family agreed, not out of authority but out of necessity. They were no longer in a position to define value. After the meeting, there was no emotional crash, no lingering doubt. Closure had been achieved without compromise. The past was acknowledged and then placed where it belonged. Behind. With emotional weight lifted, focus returned fully to the mission. A new National Education Council was formed, and leadership was requested unanimously. This role extended influence beyond policy into legacy. Decisions made here would shape generations. Acceptance was not immediate. Reflection came first. Power must always be entered consciously. The acceptance speech was brief and deliberate. It centered educators, students, and the idea that influence should serve, not separate. The message resonated deeply, especially with those who had felt invisible in systems obsessed with prestige. As work expanded, so did impact beyond education. Community development programs emerged. Leadership training initiatives were launched. Scholarships were established for those pursuing underestimated professions. The mission evolved into something larger than career. It became a movement. Public perception shifted accordingly. The story was no longer about being cut off. It was about redefining success. About proving that power does not always come from privilege, but from persistence aligned with purpose. Media framed it as inspirational. But the truth was more grounded. This was not inspiration. This was consequence. The family, now reintroduced into this reality, moved carefully. Their pride had been replaced by respect. Their authority by humility. They no longer offered opinions about career choices. They listened. They learned. And though the relationship would never be what it once was, it was no longer defined by rejection. Peace settles in fully. Not the fragile peace of temporary success, but the solid peace of self-definition. The teacher who was cut off had become a leader who could never be diminished again. One final test remained, however. Not from the family. Not from the world. But from legacy itself. The question of what power should leave behind. The kind of stillness that only arrives after storms have passed and nothing remains to be proven. Power had been earned, recognized, and stabilized. Closure had been achieved without bitterness. Influence now existed independently of validation. What remained was legacy. Legacy is the quiet question that follows success. It asks what will last when titles fade, when names stop trending, when applause moves on to the next story. For someone who had been cut off, underestimated, and dismissed, legacy was never about revenge. It was about correction. About reshaping what the world believes is worthy. The National Education Council role had matured into a platform of lasting change. Policies implemented years earlier were now producing measurable generational impact. Students from marginalized communities were entering spaces once closed to them. Teachers were no longer treated as expendable resources, but as strategic leaders. Systems once resistant to change now operated differently by default. This was the true form of power. Not dominance, not visibility, but permanence. With permanence came responsibility to step back strategically. New leaders were mentored not in theory but in resilience. They were taught how to lead without approval, how to build confidence when support is withdrawn, how to stay aligned with purpose when prestige tries to distract. The lessons were never framed as personal struggle, but they carried that truth beneath the surface. A foundation was established quietly, focused on educators who chose impact over income. Scholarships, mental health support, leadership pipelines, and community-driven innovation became its pillars. The foundation did not carry a flashy name. It carried intention. Its success was measured in lives stabilized, not headlines earned. The family watched all of this from a respectful distance. They no longer attempted to claim credit. They no longer tried to rewrite history. Acceptance had finally taken root, not because of success alone but because of consistency. Respect had replaced expectation. The dynamic had healed as much as it ever would. Occasionally, younger members of the family asked questions. Not about money or status but about courage. About choosing paths that feel right even when they are unpopular. Those conversations mattered more than any apology ever could. They signaled generational change. Public recognition continued, but it no longer carried weight. Awards were accepted graciously, then redirected toward teams and communities. Interviews were used to highlight overlooked professions. Every spotlight became an opportunity to elevate others. Power, when handled correctly, multiplies outward. There was a moment years later, when standing alone in a quiet classroom long after students had gone home, that the full circle became clear. The same kind of classroom where everything began. The same environment that had been mocked, dismissed, and devalued. And yet, it was here that the strongest foundation had been built. No bitterness surfaced. No regret lingered. Only gratitude for having stayed true when it would have been easier to quit. For having endured rejection without allowing it to define worth. For having trusted that purpose would eventually attract power. The story had never been about proving the family wrong. It had been about proving the self right. When reflecting on the journey, the lesson became unmistakable. Being cut off was not punishment. It was release. It removed dependence, stripped away expectation, and forced self-definition. Teaching had not limited potential. It had unlocked it. The world often underestimates paths that serve rather than impress. But those paths shape foundations strong enough to carry power when it arrives. And when power finally found this teacher, it did not corrupt. It clarified. A life once dismissed now defines systems. A profession once mocked now commands respect. A person once cut off now stands complete, not because of recognition but because of alignment. This is not a story of revenge. This is a story of elevation. And the final truth is simple. When you choose purpose over prestige, power will eventually find you. And when it does, no one who doubted you will ever hold power over you again.